Drugs are not the problem with addiction. Society is the problem with addiction. That's it. That's the thesis. So, a few months ago, I was at a friend's birthday party when I saw a man about my age who looked pretty rough. I couldn't place who he was, although I knew that I knew him. It hit me over an hour later. I'd gone to elementary school with him. We'll call him Jason. We talked for a while, and I found out that he was using meth. He was doing all right in life, but struggling with severe depression. So the same phrases were repeated throughout our conversation. He's a piece of crap. He doesn't deserve his job or his relationship with his family. He can't get sober. He's better off dead. That's how society tells the story. We teach children that if you do drugs one time, you'll become addicted, ruin your life, end up in jail, and die. But when this is true, is it the case because drugs make it so, or because society dictates that it be true? Addiction is defined in the Merriam Webster Dictionary as a mixture between the need for a habit forming substance and the behaviors that have harmful psychological, social, or physical effects on the addict and the people around them. Addicts have a physical need for their drug of choice, which can become so strong that they can even die without it. But when people think of addicts, they usually think more about the associated behavior than the extreme physical dependency. This is an indicator that society's main problem with drugs is how they are affected by them, not how the user is affected by them. I take issue with the definition of addiction in general. I believe that it should be broken up into two parts: physical addiction, which would define the physical dependency on the drugs, and psychological addiction, which would describe the unpredictable and unstable behaviors associated with addiction. The harm the addict does to their body is less than the harm caused by the criminal behaviors associated with addiction. While physical addiction and psychological addiction are definitely correlated, they do not always go hand in hand, and it's not the addict's drug of choice, but how society treats them that makes the difference. Do you know someone who is addicted to drugs? It's pretty likely that you do. The National Institute on Drug Abuse approximates that over 20 million Americans use drugs in 2021. How do you feel when you think of them? Most people feel pity, anger, or disgust. When we picture an addict, we think of someone who doesn't work and who lives in deplorable conditions, someone who no longer has custody of their various children or who shouldn't, someone who walks around in dirty clothing, wearing a top hat on a random Tuesday and muttering to themselves. As a result, people avoid drug users or keep them at a distance. They are talked down upon for their use, they are distanced from the people who could help them. They're treated like criminals, like horrible, evil monsters who are incapable of rational thought or behavior or general human emotion. The opinion that drug addiction has a common look to it is a misconception. I have a friend who's an avid drug user. His drug of choice has been ketamine lately, although he also likes cocaine and hallucinogens. This friend, who we'll call Bradley, doesn't use methamphetamines like Jason, but at one point in time in life he did. Why did he quit? It wasn't because he had to or because his loved ones wanted him to. He told me that he quit this highly addictive drug because the quality went down. That's right, guys, the meth wasn't as good as it used to be, so he just stopped doing it. Today, Bradley uses one drug or another almost nightly. During the day, he works Monday through Friday doing an apprenticeship to become an electrician and is almost done with the necessary classes to do the work on his own. He gets paid very well, even as an apprentice. How is Bradley able to avoid psychological addiction despite consistent use and stop a notoriously harmful and addictive drug on a whim? I believe it has a lot to do with his perception of his use. Bradley doesn't feel bad about what he does. He sees snorting a line of ketamine the same way that you may see drinking a beer after work. He doesn't leave a safe environment. No one talks down to him about his drug use because he keeps it from people who would disapprove. He lives his life responsibly and he doesn't let the drugs do him. Seems to be the case for many drug users and addicts. People only see what they're told to see when they think of addicts. In reality, drug users look like normal people who wouldn't look any different than the next or be judged any differently. They're people who usually look about like I do right now. Stand me next to the addict outside the gas station. Which of us has been up all night using drugs? And which of us was up all night trying to squeeze in as much homework as possible after work before the kids got up for school? Even if you don't know that you know a drug user, you probably do. Because addiction is invisible, people like Bradley are able to become to avoid becoming psychological addicts who engage in problematic behavior. When society sees an addict as a monster, the addict begins to see themselves that way and acts accordingly. It is at this point that drug use goes from victimless crime to scourge of society. When a person is treated like a criminal instead of like a normal person, what are they likely to become? The switch between physical addiction and psychological addiction begins in a state of society-induced poverty. If a person loses their job because of a failed drug test, they often find it difficult to find a new one or become too discouraged to even try. Because of their physical addiction, job loss doesn't stop them from seeking the drugs. This, as well as the fact that the drugs are illegal to begin with, often leads to criminal activity in order to get the drugs. This criminal activity then leads to incarceration, and incarceration leads to the addict losing their loved ones and friends and months to years to decades of their lives. They lose their homes and begin living in hotels or even end up homeless. They begin selling drugs in order to afford to survive. They get shot over drug money. They overdose because of the stress of all this is only manageable through further drug use. They die. The physical addiction in those cases is not the cause of death. It is a psychological addiction caused not by the drug itself but by society that ends in the early demise of the addict. It seems like a daunting task, but I believe that it's possible for society to humanize drug users. The biggest way that would help is to change the way that drugs are treated legally in the United States. Incarceration is the biggest consequence of drug addiction and one of the biggest detriments to the addict living a normal life upon recovery. Ironically, it seems that the threat of jail time isn't doing anything to solve the problem. A study done in 2021 by the ACLU found that 83% of Americans see the so-called war on drugs as a failure. If we truly wanted to help addicts, we could adopt programs similar to the ones in 30 other countries who have decriminalized drugs. In some countries, such as Portugal, treatment is offered over jail. If someone in Portugal is caught doing drugs or engaging in problematic behavior, they are allowed to detox and then given the option of going to treatment or going home. In this case, they're allowed to go about their lives as much as usual without the physical addiction causing psychological addiction. It's then treated much like alcohol. If someone only does one line of coke at a party or only drinks one beer, they both go home safe and unbothered. If someone becomes unhinged on either substance, they go to jail. Makes sense, right? By treating them the same, users are steered clear of many of the risk factors of psychological addiction. Jason has a relationship with his children. He has his own company that does landscaping. He's doing all right for himself. His addiction is physical, but it doesn't cause his symptoms of psychological addiction. What creates the guilt and depression he experiences isn't the drug itself, but the way society makes him feel about using it. Think back to Bradley. He's doing great. However, one failed drug test or one instance of being pulled over and searched at the wrong time, and he could use years of hard work and dedication over his career path. Since he's been smart enough to avoid that, he continues to use drugs and work hard toward his fulfillment. The bottom line here is that people are treated better, they do better. This is as true for an addict as it is for you and me. Jason said something else that really opened my eyes. Why try to get off drugs? Life is going to be like this anyway, but it doesn't have to be. We don't have to allow it to be this way. It's up to those of us who are not users to show compassion and allow users to feel worthy of a normal life. Once we change how we view addicts and how we treat them, they'll suffer from less of the depression and guilt similar to what Jason experiences. Our treatment of addicts ruins their entire futures. They are humans, just like we are. They have talents, interests, ideas, and their own purpose. Who are we, who are not them, to take that away from them? If we don't want a drug problem in America, we need to stop looking at users like they're less than human and thrusting them into an endless cycle of poverty and depression, and start changing the way they are treated from the legal grounds up. I've said it once and I'll say it again. Drugs are not the problem with addiction. Society is the problem with addiction. That's it. That's the conclusion.